From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $50 million studio. I'm the Pro Wrestle Machine. Wrestling Observer Newsletter. July 28, 2014. The Beginnings of Mil Mascaras. By Steve Dr. Lucha Sims. This coming Friday evening, July 25, 2014, a Lucha Libre card will take place at La Arena Coliseo de Occidente in Guadalajara, Jalisco, Mexico. The card is in honor of the 50th anniversary of the debut of the wrestler Mil Mascaras, Aaron Rodriguez, whose first match with that name took place in that very same arena on Friday, August 21, 1964. There have not been many men who have wrestled for longer than 50 years. There's Luthez and Corsica Joe and Dory Funk Jr. What makes this streak even rarer is a continuousness. Unlike the others, Rodriguez rarely took more than a couple weeks vacation off, and will even now take almost any booking he can get, and still almost always works in the main event. Fewer still have worked into their 70s or beyond age 75, the age Mascaras turned this past week. Mil's matches today are a sad spectacle for those who saw him in his prime. He can still get around, but he has so much trouble now getting up and down that he basically doesn't do any spots that would require him to do that. Just this year, he has put into semi-permanent retirement his finisher, the cross-body block from the top rope, though it would surprise no one if he tried one in Fall 3 of the main event this Friday night. How did this character come to be, and how did this man come to fill that role? Though evidence of carnival sideshow wrestling occurring in Mexico, especially in towns on or near the U.S. border, exists back to 1869, and though occasional full cards, usually promoted by a boxing promoter, can be traced to the second decade of the 1900s, Lucha Libre as we know really started to form in the early 1930s. A government employee named Salvador Luteroth Gonzalez, on assignment in 1931 in Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, had seen a sold-out wrestling show in El Paso, Texas. He decided to try and start a business from scratch promoting wrestling, and after more than a year of stops and starts, his company debuted on September 21, 1933. The first 10 years of his business were rough. He had to fend off competitors, pay what he felt was an exorbitant percentage in rent to arena owners. Usually boxing promoters find ways to sell tickets in a poor economy. The U.S. Great Depression reverberated in Mexico City, and had to run enough shows to keep wrestlers employed. Still, taking cues from the U.S. promotions, he created titles, champions, and stars. Finding that his crowd was primarily low-income and recognizing how the fans looked to the shows as a catharsis and a mirror to their own daily struggles, Luteroth began more and more to emphasize characters and the show in his business. With the help of a very large win in the national lottery, Luteroth expanded his business and eventually was able to finance the construction of his own wrestling palace in Mexico City, Arena Coliseo, which opened in April 1943. The main event that night, to this day one of the 10 most famous matches in Mexican wrestling history, pitted a man, Carlos Tarzan Lopez, the Tarzan simply for his bodybuilder physique, against a character, a sort of evil masked superhero, El Santo. El Santo was played by Rodolfo Guzman Herta, who had recently debuted the gimmick. Guzman was the brother of Luteroth's lead heel at the time, Miguel Blackie Guzman, who later became one of the biggest stars in the history of Texas wrestling as a babyface in the 1950s. The opening of the arena and the first singles match between the two stars, both of whom held titles, was a roaring box office success. For the record, Lopez was at that time the biggest star in Lucha Libre, and the result of his winning over Santo 2-0 was not that much of a surprise at that point in each man's career. But El Santo was getting over very well in Mexico City and soon eclipsed his brother as Luteroth's top heel. He was about to get over not only as the most notable wrestler ever in Mexico but also as one of the top entertainment figures as well, due to several positive trends combining in the early 1950s. One was simple economics. Luteroth had run his business well. He now could support a full-time circuit. Indeed, his business was growing enough that he could expand. Friends and businessmen in other larger cities and border towns in Mexico called Luteroth trying to book cards for their towns. Luteroth of course knew that booking his stars in Guadalajara, Jalisco, or Monterrey, Nuevo Leon even after travel expenses, would pay more than booking them in front of a few fans at tiny Arena Xochimilco on Monday and Arena Los Reyes La Paz on Tuesday. These were two small arenas in the Distrito Federal, suburban Mexico City. He had also learned the lesson every local promoter learns eventually, that except for the one or two superstars a generation, fans don't want to see the same guys on top 3, 4, 5, 6 years running. Some rotation of talent around the country was actually Much better for the promoter and the talent. For lucha libre, Mexican professional wrestling, the 1950s and 1960s are often referred to as the Golden Age. Business was booming all over the country, and as more people found jobs connected to the industry than any time in the industry's history. At the time, almost all promoting was local, through posters slapped on electrical poles and light poles and business windows and car repair shutter doors and such. The first wrestling magazine, Vox y Lucha, would not debut until September 1953. The one national or regional avenue was newspapers. Newsstands were a huge thriving business as from the first decade of the 21st century in Mexico, especially Mexico City, the use of public transportation was and is extremely high. La Afición was Mexico's first national daily sports paper, and its editor, Fray Nano, Alejandro Aguilar Reyes, generally a lucha libre fan on his own, was heavily and successfully courted by Lutteroth for mostly favorable coverage as a sport. One of the other things sold at newsstands were little 12 centimeters by 15 centimeters comic books. In fact, for many newsstands other than the combined sales of the day's daily newspapers, of which back then there were a dozen or more in Mexico City, seriously, the comic books ranked as the best-selling thing they offered. Sometimes their subjects were actual historical or living persons, and those little comics would be called historietas. One of the most successful of the authors of these little books was José Guadalupe Cruz. Professionally, he went by José G. Cruz. He ran the largest of the companies that produced these pepines. Personally, he liked Santo and lucha libre. Professionally, it dawned on him in the early 1950s what a success could be made from making Santo a superhero in a comic book series, not unlike a Dick Tracy crossed with a Batman. Santo un Seminario Atómico debuted on September 3, 1952. It was soon publishing 3 31-page issues each week, with a readership estimated to be 33% of the literate population of the whole country. 1952 was the year Televisa started up, as Televicentro, in Guadalajara and tried to run opposition to Lutteroth, in their attempt to copy the U.S., where wrestling was a very successful staple of early television. They created a whole new wave of stars. They also tried to lure El Santo away from Lutteroth, as any modern-day wrestling fan would understand. Another of these fortunate trends was the beginning of the lucha superhero movies. One of the things that Jesus Garza, the Televicentro vice president, trying to ensure the success of his lucha programming did, was to produce a motion picture. It starred El Santo, and was titled Santo, El Enmascarado de Plata. The movie was in no small part a carrot to get Santo to jump. But the producers really did believe that a movie like this would succeed financially. This was early in 1952. Santo was not a fan of the movie that was proposed to him, and he thought the movie would fail. He was not convinced the script was any good. He thought the producers and director would not make a quality movie, and he would not be in control of how his image might be portrayed. There were other issues as well. No dummy, Lutteroth knew from the moment he heard about this just exactly what all of this movie stuff was for. He successfully pressured Santo to decline the offer. Medico Asesino ended up filming that movie. A key to Lutteroth's offer was to promise Santa the biggest match in Mexican wrestling history. While that today may sound hyperbolic, more than 60 years later, the El Santo vs. Black Shadow Mask vs. Mask match is considered the biggest match in lucha libre history. It started a tradition that still is true today, that the biggest matches in lucha libre are the Mask vs. Mask matches. Lutteroth offered Santo the win and the Mask of the Black Shadow in a match later that year. The match was the genesis of the building of Arena Mexico, and led to the kickoff of the biggest feud in lucha libre history, Santo vs. Blue Demon, the tag team partner of Black Shadow. All of this came together to make Santo into a cross-cultural celebrity far beyond wrestling, though still based on his wrestling character. There was one other thing this sequence of events started. It laid the cornerstone for the creation of Mil Mascaras. Wrestling between 1953 and 1963 was full of wrestling historietas, wrestling movies, wrestling shows, and big-name wrestlers from all over the world. Mexico City was a fairly regular stop for NWA World Heavyweight Champion Lou Thesz, who always spoke very highly of Lutteroth, to defend his title. Accordingly, the appetite for more superstars who could work movies and sell comic books was high. But comic books weren't the only part of the business that was expanding at newsstands. During the golden age of lucha libre, wrestling magazines began to proliferate even widely than newspapers. In 1991, during a trip to Mexico City, the week of the wrestlers' strike, I purchased 22 separate weekly wrestling magazines, all very colorful, with a wide variety of typefaces and sizes. They clamored for the eye of a reader hurrying to catch a colectivo to work or back home, or a reader out to buy groceries or get his or her car fixed. The three biggest were Box y Lucha, the only one of those 22 still around today, the Blue Bible, famous for listing most every card in the country in the back pages, El Halcón, the insider's favorite that came closest to the thin blue line and had the best bios, and Lucha Libre, a 6 inches by 6 inches square magazine that was actually the biggest selling and most popular of the whole bunch. It was very much a mass-market publication aimed at the general interest and occasional fan. It was noted not only for monthly rankings of the wrestlers but also for fictional lucha-themed comic strips in each issue, strips like would be seen in Jose G. Cruz's Pepines. The editor of Lucha Libre was Valente Perez Hernandez. While he ran his business well, what Perez really liked to do most was to think up new characters, draw new masks and costumes, and figure out storylines for his magazine's comic strips. Of note, he also had the franchise to the main magazine of that time covering bodybuilders in Mexico, Muscle Power, an offshoot of the U.S. publication produced by Joe Weider. By the early 1960s, in 2 or 3 cases, a fictional wrestler hero of one of his comic strips would be popular enough that a promoter, not Letteroth, would debut a wrestler under a mask as that character on spot shows around Mexico City. The historical record does not seem to exist as to the exact moment of the birth of the concept of Mil Mascaras. But one day, I believe in late 1961, Perez called in one of his main artists and asked him to begin test panels for a superhero called Mil Mascaras. The concept was that he was a superhero not with one mask but he was the man of 1,000 masks. The concept being it was an ingenious way of shielding his identity from the forces of evil. By 1962, this character was the most popular of all the ones that ran in Lucha Libre magazine. In 1963, Perez went to Letteroth and suggested that an actual wrestler be created to fill that role and be put on the main Mexico City roster as well. What's notable about this is that many readers of the publication had already thought this was a comic of an actually active luchador, just one that didn't wrestle in their area. Letteroth agreed and casting began. For a variety of reasons, El Santo's real successes in movies really only came in the 1960s. Most historians seem to agree that the 1950s movies in which Santo appeared, never as the star, were bombs. The 1961 movie Santo vs. the Zombies and especially the 1962 Santo vs. the Zombie Women, with Santo as the lead star, really took off. They took off so well that, finally, in 1962 Letteroth turned Santo Technico, babyface, after Santo's 20-plus year run as a rudo, heel, at Santo's own insistence. Soon the Blue Demon started making these sorts of B-movies as well, then so did Ray Mendoza and other wrestlers. Mexican studios were on the lookout for potential new stars. And as Santo got hot, he spent more and more days on movie sets and fewer in wrestling arenas. Letteroth had, by the mid-1940s, made an annual anniversary show in September, the major show of his calendar year. 1964 would be the 31st anniversary, not a nice round number like the year before. Letteroth wanted something to spice up the show, to make it even more special, so as to justify increasing the ticket prices. Letteroth, Perez, and several of the Letteroth's office staff looked everywhere for a completely new wrestler to debut as the comic book hero Mil Mascaras, coming to life. Nearly 2 decades later, a similar concept took place in Japan where the comic and cartoon hero, Tiger Mask, debuted, with Satoru Sayama in the role. In March 1964, they settled on a bodybuilder they thought would do this trick. His name was Jorge Galindo. Galindo was a true rookie. He was told honestly what big plans there were for this character. He would debut in the main event, something Letteroth had never done before, with anyone. And it would be on the biggest show of the year. He was told he would be promoted as equal to the company's lead babyface. Galindo would be promoted as an ultimate superhero come to life. The superhero fans could see with their own eyes, one with the body of a Greek god. He would be the young heir apparent to the throne of Santo, who was nearing 50 at that point, and had a completely unremarkable physique. Galindo was uncertain about taking the role from the start, mostly due to compressed time frame he was shown and the magnitude of the planned push. He knew that he had 6 months to get ready for his debut. He wanted 18 months to get ready, so that he would debut as good as the level he would be pushed at. He knew that being handed the keys to the castle, he would be subject to quite the backlash from the rest of the roster. He suggested first debuting out in the Boondocks as Belo Antonio. Letteroth replied that this was a character in which the man filling that role would have to be 100% behind, or it would be a massive failure. In April 1964, there was an actual screen test and the beginning of in-ring training. Perez even starting publishing photos in Lucha Libre of Galindo in the costume of Mil Mascaras. But before that month ran out, Galindo backed out, honorably by all accounts. He debuted later that year as Alas de Oro, and a couple of years thereafter quietly left the business. Perez went back to his office that day in late April in a funk. He mentioned why he was depressed to the man who was writing the column in Muscle Power about food and sports medicine, a young weightlifter and bodybuilder from San Luis Potosi. The writer, named Aaron Rodriguez, had come to Perez's attention when he won the Mr. Mexico contest in 1961. He was still competing, as was most everyone who worked on that magazine at that time. Rodriguez, interviewed in Super Luchas Grafico 22, recalled that he had wrestled and done judo as an amateur. While he has never said so publicly, his nephew, the current Alberto Del Rio, said that his grandfather, the father of the three wrestling Rodriguez brothers, Aaron, Jose, Mascaras, and Pablo, El Cicotalico, had briefly been a pro wrestler. Aaron Rodriguez had covered the Pan American Games in Brazil for Perez. He had just been pulled from an assignment to cover the Olympic Games in Tokyo since Mexico had apparently withdrawn its entire Olympic delegation due to financial shenanigans within its organizing committee. There is a story that I can't confirm that Rodriguez was actually selected, under his real name, to represent Mexico in Greco-Roman wrestling at the 1964 Olympics. When Mascaras would wrestle in the late 70s and early 80s in San Jose, he would train with several members of Mexico's Olympic and national judo team that went to college at San Jose State to train under legendary coach Yoshi Uchida. They were all under the impression that Aaron, who they would note was still formidable in training, was a champion in judo, and was a 1964 Olympic hopeful in that sport when he got the Mil Mascaras role. While never considered the toughest guy in wrestling, Mascaras in his youth had a shooter reputation and did prove it in California against guys on more than one occasion with tough heels who didn't like his attitude in the ring and wanted to prove a point. Rodriguez had little money and was very intrigued in this now vacant role to play Mil Mascaras. He attended shows in San Luis Potosi as early as age 15 or 16. He was particularly intrigued by the strength/agility combination of bodybuilder turned high-flying luchador Dorael Dory Dixon. Dixon had been a major star in the United States when promoters realized that in many markets, headlining with charismatic black babyface superstars was huge for business. Dixon, like Bobo Brazil, Bearcat Wright and Sailor Art Thomas, were among the top faces in the country, with Dixon headlining in the major markets, including Madison Square Garden, as a frequent opponent of world champion Buddy Rogers. Rodriguez passed the initial interviews with Perez and Lutteroth. His personality and charisma, his physique and style of carrying himself, impressed both. A key in what is notable is that the biggest knock in wrestling of Mascaras is also the same reason why Perez and Lutteroth were so high on him: his enormous ego. The feeling is to portray to the public of being a larger-than-life Superman. You have to believe in it to pull it off. In fact, the selection process went so well that Lutteroth was actually convinced to change his mind and agree with Galindo on one point, that if you have the right person, this character should not be rushed, and debuted on the main roster at the biggest show of the year when he was so inexperienced that the audience may see through him. Lutteroth worked backwards, planning for a Mexico City main event debut for Mil Mascaras a year later, at the 32nd anniversary show in September 1965. All parties agreed that training would begin, for about 90 days, to be followed by about a year's worth of wrestling in the hinterland, away from view of the Lucha Libre magazines. Lutteroth brought Rodriguez in, along with Perez, who got a piece of the revenue as owner of the trademark, in April 1964 to sign an actual personal services contract. Included in that was a clause that Rodriguez would train with one of the Lutteroth Company trainers in Mexico City. Rodriguez, being Rodriguez, went out the next day and tried to connect on his own with a local trainer of no particular repute called General Flores, but Flores wanted to charge Rodriguez 1,200 pesos a month to train. Rodriguez told him where to stick it and went back to Perez and said, "Okay, I'll do it your way." Perez referred him to the head of the training gym at Arena Mexico, a very famous and well-respected wrestler named Raul Romero. Romero listened to the whole story, the plans they have for this guy to debut on top, everything. Romero verified this with Lutteroth and then said, "No, I already have so many trainees on the roster who need my help, and you will be working for the next year out of the way, far away from Mexico City. The man you need to see to train you is El Diablo Velasco Cuauhtemoc Velasco Vargas, in Guadalajara." Lutteroth and Romero called Velasco and made it clear verbally and financially that Rodriguez needed to be his top priority for the next year. A few days later, Velasco began to train Rodriguez. In the late 1950s, Lutteroth had helped fund the construction of a new arena in Guadalajara, then Mexico's second most populous city. Following closely, Though not exactly the same architectural plans used in the 1940s construction of Arena Coliseo in Mexico City, La Arena Coliseo de Guadalajara, also called Arena Coliseo de Occidente, debuted on June 20, 1959. Just as in Mexico City, Lutteroth built the arena with a square office building in the upper floor of which contained the building offices and a gym. Velasco was the head trainer. Rodriguez arrived mid-April 1964, about 20 weeks before he would officially debut, having left his apartment, thrown everything into his car, and telling all his friends there that they would not hear from him again until Christmas. To say that Rodriguez took to this well would be an understatement. Perez and Lutteroth had picked the right man. The bodybuilder, who appeared stronger than the rest, also exhibited unusual grace and agility, and could do the dives that were cutting art at the time as well as the lighter weight guys. But he hated to sell. He greatly preferred to be the invincible babyface, not the one who suffers but overcomes. He hated to sell even more than he hated to lose. Not Velasco, not Lutteroth. At this day, 50 years later, no one yet ever successfully changed his mind on that. Back in Mexico City, the promotional machine kicked into gear. Lots of things were done, but the main thing people remember, and remember well, is that Perez organized a promotion in his magazine asking fans to send in their designs for a mask for the character. No rewards, no winners, just send in your mask designs. He got inundated. Rodriguez noted in the same Super Luchas Grafico interview that a lot of his initial training was calisthenics. He arrived weighing 88 kilograms, 193 pounds, and when El Mil Mascaras debuted 20 weeks later, he was at 76 kilograms, 167 pounds. The training was a lot of running and tumbling and stamina work. They put him through 6 hours a day of training sessions those first 3 months, and apparently he even had done enough Greco-Roman wrestling in his background that he helped train others in that discipline. Aaron Rodriguez was born July 15, 1939, in the central Mexican city of San Luis Potosi, the capital city of the state with the same name. He had 2 brothers who wrestled, Pablo, who was 1 year younger, and Jose, the father of Alberto Del Rio, who ended up being an all-time great himself, who was 12 years younger. What wasn't known is that his sister also married a wrestler, Victor Gonzalez. This was, for obvious reasons, one of wrestling's best-kept secrets. Gonzalez in the late 60s and throughout the 70s became perhaps the greatest long-term rival of Mil Mascaras. Rival in the sense of the guy who always put him over in main events. Many point to a mask versus hair match at the Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles, which sold out in advance and turned thousands away at the door, in the late 60s between Mil Mascaras and Gonzalez, better known as Black Gordman, that established both men and led to them being on top each for the next decade plus. Mike LaBelle had frequently said it was Mascaras versus Gordman, and not Fred Blassie versus John Tolos. That was the biggest match he ever promoted. He also said it was the one, had he known enough at the time to go to the Coliseum, that would have done the bigger gate. Gordman worked main events against him all over the world, almost always losing in tag team matches, as half of the famed Red Devils, Black Gordman, and the Great Goliath. Whether it was California, Texas, or northern Mexico, the biggest attraction for year was Mascaras and a Mexican partner, whether it be Ray Mendoza, El Santo, Jose Lothario, Raul Mata, Dos Caras, or many others, against the Red Devils, also known as the G-Boys. Now, past his 25th birthday, Aaron Rodriguez was ready to embark upon his life's mission. With the big debut was scheduled for September 1965, Lutteroth worked up a calendar of goals and progressions. He was to wrestle in front of fans in August and September of 1964, so Lutteroth could monitor his actual progress in real time, see how he handled all the peripherals, and how the fans reacted. They did not want Rodriguez to be in his literal first match, making first match mistakes in the main event at Arena Mexico. Instead, Rodriguez had his first match quietly debuted in late April 1964, I believe April 30th, 1964, as Ricardo Duran, with a full-body costume to hide his impressive physique, without a mask, wrestling in small arenas in Guadalajara suburbs and the area. Guadalajara was chosen as the site of the debut as Mil Mascaras at Arena Coliseo, with Lutteroth and Perez and other key players in the game in attendance, on August 25, 1964. The debut match would be in the main event, with Mascaras and former NWA World Middleweight Champion Rolando Vera, real name Rolando Hernandez, then 50, doing the father figure role, facing El Espanto 3, 25-year-old Miguel Vasquez, who had just lost his mask to Huracan Ramirez, and the Red Terror, Samuel Chavez, a 10-year-plus veteran who was a big star locally but never really worked much outside Guadalajara. Mascaras and Vera won. You can just imagine how this was played up in Lucha Libre. He continued to work in small shows with no exposure. The second appearance of Mil Mascaras was September 8, 1964, in Irapuato, teaming with Felipe Hamley and Raul Reyes to beat all three Espantos. Lee 43, who a few years later would be a headliner for Ed Francis in Hawaii, is the tag team partner of Billy Robinson. Reyes, then 36, who trained Negro Casas, Fuerza Guerrera and Octagon, became a star in California during the 70s, including a big main event program with John Tolos. Newspaper reports at the time indicate thousands of people were turned away that night. He may have been a big hit at the gate from day one, but one set of people who were not initially impressed were the members of the Distrito Federal Comisión de Box y Lucha. As reported in last week's issue of Super Luchas, issue 528, page 38, which included a picture of the coverage of the incident from a 1965 issue of Arena magazine, Mascaras was denied a license to wrestle in the Distrito Federal. He tested sometime in late September or early October, and the commissioners on duty did not pass him. According to the published report, they did not find him to be sufficiently competent as a wrestler. The Unión Nacional de Luchadores filed a protest, publicly claiming merely that in their eyes that they felt he was indeed competent enough. Privately they were furious, as were Perez and Luteroff, for two reasons. 1. By this time they were sure history proved them correct, that this was a once-in-a-generation goose that would lay golden eggs, and that he was going to put a lot of money into everyone's pockets. Second, it's one thing to say you don't find him competent enough yet, even if we disagree, and just not say that and just say that we'll retest him in 6 months. But who in the hell is the genius who released this failure to the media? What kind of boneheaded decision is that? You can't do that with the best prospect to come along in years. Rodriguez took his wrestling license test earlier than planned because his reception in his early matches was so monstrous. After his second match with the name, when he was announced in other cities, fans were buying tickets in advance to make sure they'd see him in an era when nobody ever bought tickets until the day of the show. His drawing power was so much bigger than expected that Luteroff was revising plans, considering bringing up him to the main roster much earlier than expected, in January or February, and at this point he didn't want to wait a day longer than necessary. The revised idea was also prompted in part by the fact that El Santo's availability was getting less and less. By this point, due to his movie commitments, they could get occasional dates for Santo matches, but working programs with Santo was impossible. Luteroff ran multiple shows on a daily basis, so needed anyone who could draw. The commission administered tests only twice a year back then, thus the rush to get Rodriguez certified after only his second professional match. You may have heard the old Garth Brooks song that goes, "Thank you Lord for unanswered prayers." That's probably the case here. After the Distrito Federal setback, Rodriguez worked 9 months, honing his abilities and spots. As big a star as Mil Mascaras already was, he was sent to the northwest part of the Mexico, as far away from the media as possible. He worked so far out in the countryside, and using other names, that historians can find only one extant record of a card from the period October 1, 1964, to July 1, 1965, a show in Mexicali. Not only was Santo hardly available, but the other big star, Blue Demon, was injured and out of action for several months. Luteroff abandoned plans to hold off the Mexico City main roster debut until the 32nd anniversary show in September. Instead, the debut of Mil Mascaras was on Friday, July 16, 1965, one day after his 26th birthday. To emphasize how important this was, how major this tournament was, it was the only match on the card, a gimmick Luteroff had never used in his 32 years as a promoter. In a similar vein as was done for his true debut in Guadalajara with Rolando Vera, Mascaras was given a living legend father figure as his padrino. His debut partner was the beloved Black Shadow himself, Alejandro Cruz. Needless to say, they won the tournament, in the final cleanly defeating the team considered to be the top tag team at the time in all of Mexico, René Guajardo and Karloff Lagarde. Success was quick. Mil Mascaras won his first Mask vs. Hair match in April 1966, over the same Benny Gallant against whom El Santo turned face in 1962. He won his first title in June 1967, beating El Espanto I for the Mexican national light heavyweight title. And he became a movie star, though he came just as that wave of masked superhero movies was ending. The man who made the most number of and most profitable one of the Lucha Star superhero B movies in Mexico was Enrique Vergara. As January 1, 1966, dawned, he was in a quandary. His two leading stars were unavailable, and he had a movie ready to shoot. Blue Demon was out several months with a serious injury. Santo wanted a raise after his contract with Vergara Studio ran out on December 31, 1965, no small part of the reason that Vergara and the studio filmed non-stop with him for 1964 and 1965. Like a prodigal athlete early in his career in U.S. professional sports, Santo had proven to be a giant success but was still working under the terms of his signed years earlier contract. The producers were making large sums of money on these movies. Santo was not, and he never did. In fact, he never even trademarked his own ring name, image, or likeness. The week after El Santo died in February 1984, virtually the first thing that his son, Jorge, who now wrestles as El Hijo del Santo did, was to go register the name /trademark/images. Vergara related his problem to Perez, who wasted no time in recommending Mil Mascaras as a ready substitute. Rodriguez jumped at this chance and started filming the first of his almost 20 movies. The main mask he wore in his first movie, Los Canales, was one of the ones sent in by a fan during the fan design contest from a young fan named Manuel Villaflores from Octotlan, Jalisco. The filming of the movie went so well that the studio put Los Canales in the can, wrote and filmed so quickly that they shot wholly in black and white, a new movie called Mil Mascaras, to introduce the character to people who had not read the comic strip in the magazines or followed Lucha Libre. That was the start. Over the next few years he debuted first in California as the movie star wrestler, the Superman of wrestling, and became an instant hit in Texas, and even more, Japan, where kids of the 70s who grew up as members of Japan's Mil Mascaras fan club ended up being some of the most influential people in the industry as it grew and changed in the 80s. In the US he wasn't quite as big outside of Texas and California, although Mascaras was a major attraction in the 70s in Madison Square Garden. But due to his colorful costumes and physique, and the fact he was Bill Apter's favorite wrestler, almost nobody in the 70s was on more magazine covers in the US a few years later, when Eddie Einhorn attempted to challenge the NWA and WWF in the biggest national promotional war of the 70s, his choice to build around as the IWA World Heavyweight Champion was Mil Mascaras. Yet, for all the reasons that allowed him to project himself as the Superman of wrestling and draw so well as an attraction, his ego, lack of selling, only wanting to do his own spots, and very rarely agreeing to losing, he probably had less respect in the dressing rooms than any star of his caliber. Yet outside wrestling, with the exception of probably Hulk Hogan and Antonio Inoki, nobody of his generation was a more enduring star to the general public in their home country, and Mascaras crossed over in the strong Hispanic markets in the US, where for years he was the biggest drawing card of the 70s. The appearances of fans in Mascaras masks, like Santo masks and Rey Mysterio masks, at sporting events, most notably soccer games that draw from the Hispanic audience, remain strong today. A few years ago he had his own postage stamp made in Mexico. Go to any large gathering in California, and probably Texas, for a major Halloween party, and you'll always see at least a few people wearing Mascaras masks. By a wide margin, there is no wrestler in Mexico as famous or as beloved as El Santo, and Blue Demon would be in the second slot, with either Mascaras or El Solitario in most lists as third. But once you leave Mexico, the most famous Mexican wrestler ever was Mascaras, whether it be the US, Puerto Rico, Africa, where he sold out many stadium shows in the 70s and early 80s, or Japan, since Eddie Guerrero was of Mexican ancestry but grew up an American in El Paso, and Rey Mysterio grew up in San Isidro, California. It's also clear in time that will change. Babe Ruth's name will live forever, and Mickey Mantle, the most popular athlete in the US of his generation, is becoming more and more forgotten as those who grew up with him pass away. The reality is El Santo is Babe Ruth and more, a larger-than-life cultural icon who will be remembered for generations. Mascaras is Mickey Mantle, although still living, and even still performing. His trademark mask design would be recognizable to people who weren't wrestling fans in Mexico, and pretty much anyone of Hispanic descent living in the southwestern US, but he is no longer the superhero he portrayed in his heyday so long ago, and still tries to portray today.